This is you. Human waste fills the streets everywhere around you. Dead bodies are stacked up, being eaten by the birds as we speak, and most of the people here can't even afford a piece of bread. Welcome to the Dark Ages. You're born somewhere between the 5th and 15th centuries, give or take a few plagues. Your birth isn't celebrated, there are no balloons, no cigars, no social media posts. Most likely your mother gives birth to you on a dirt floor, while your father waits outside hoping you come out with all your limbs. That's about as good as it gets. Your first big challenge was to actually survive. Infant mortality was absurdly high. Up to 30 to 50% of children die before the age of 5. And even if you do survive, you'll probably never know your exact age or birthday. Calendars are for kings, and I hate to break it to you, but you are dirt poor. You're not special, you're not chosen, you're just another peasant. Another body to work the land, pay taxes, and die quietly when it's your turn. Basically, you're living the dream. By the time you're 5, you've most likely already seen your fair share of dead bodies. By 6, you're already working. There's no such thing as childhood, just smaller adults who get yelled at more. You're sent to help with crops, fetch water, clean chamber pots, and feed the livestock. Toys? Never heard of them. Your toy is a stick or a rock, and if you're lucky, a slightly rounder rock. And school? Not a chance. Unless you're rich, your chance of being able to read a book is worse than your survival rate, which is not very high. Your diet is 99% bread, maybe some vegetables if it's a good year, and if it's a bad year, you eat bark. No, seriously, people actually boiled tree bark when crops went bad and people were starving. I've never actually tried bark, but I can't imagine it's as bad as Brussels sprouts. As you hit your teens, you're old enough to be considered an adult now. Hope you enjoyed those 12 years of back-breaking labor and constant illness, because it's time to give your life to a local lord who doesn't even know your name. You're probably a serf, which is just a fancy word for a peasant, who legally can't leave the land they work on. So yeah, you're not a slave exactly, but also you kinda are. Your home is a one-room wooden hut. No chimney, no insulation. In the winter, you sleep with the animals for warmth, which sounds cute until the cow farts in your face at 2 a.m. Baths are rare. Once a week if you're wealthy, once a year if you're not. I couldn't imagine what that would smell like, but I bet the flies back then were having the time of their lives. You own maybe 2 sets of clothes, both itchy and almost never get washed. Shoes are optional, and your teeth are most likely gone before you hit your 20s. So, hopefully you find yourself a lucky lady who doesn't mind all those, flaws you have. And if all that wasn't already bad enough, you had to deal with the Black Death. Yeah, even if you didn't know what this was, almost nothing good would be named the Black Death. So that should tell you enough. In the mid-1300s, it wiped out between 75 to 200 million people worldwide, including 1/3 of Europe's population. The symptoms? Sudden fever, vomiting, and painful black boils. If you had any of these symptoms, well, it usually meant you would be dead in under a week. I'm sorry I had to be the one to break you the news. Towns emptied overnight. Entire families died in a single day. Bodies piled up in the streets. It was a horror show with no intermission. And if you were lucky enough to not die from the plague, then you're probably dying a few weeks later from an infection, splinters, childbirth, unless you're a guy, of course, starving, executions, and animals attacking you. Hanging was the go-to method for theft, murder, or rebellion. It was usually done in public on a gallows. Sometimes it was a slow and painful death, especially if the neck didn't break, and the heads were often left hanging afterward as a warning to everyone else. They also had beheadings. This was usually quick if the executioner was skilled, but if not, it might take a few swings. Burned at the stake, this is pretty self-explanatory. Stoning, where a crowd would throw stones until the person died. Drowning, and dragged by horse until they died. I'm just not too sure which one is the worst. It might be getting stones thrown at you until you die a slow death. That sounds absolutely terrible. Executions definitely weren't the only way people were dying. Crops failed constantly due to bad weather, disease, or just plain bad luck. And when that happens, people had to eat anything and everything. Bark, rats, leather, dirt, I mean even shoelaces if they had to. If you somehow survived all that, you still had to deal with smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, tuberculosis, typhoid, and let's not forget good old sweating sickness, which killed people in hours and still has no known cause. Wars were also a huge problem back then. There were wars like the 100 Years' War that killed around 2 to 3 million people, the Crusades, which killed between 1 to 3 million people, and the Viking raids and invasions. The Vikings didn't kill nearly as many people, only in the tens of thousands, but they would target rich villages and steal gold, food, livestock, weapons, and slaves. Plus, they sometimes burned what they couldn't carry and would live in the land they just raided. That has to be one of the most disrespectful things I've ever heard. Not only did they steal everything and kill people, but they also lived with them afterwards. The life expectancy back then wasn't exactly high, around 30 to 35 years assuming you made it past your childhood. If you reached 40, you were basically a walking miracle because the doctors back then weren't necessarily great. Say you broke a bone. The solution? They cut it off. Have a fever? Well, time to drain your blood, obviously. Mental illness? That means you were possessed. So they'll drill a hole in your skull. Yeah, literally drill a hole into your skull. How they thought this was a good idea is beyond me. They may also chain you to a wall, making sure there was no way you could move. Teeth hurting? Rip them out. These are actual documented cures from the Dark Ages. Rubbing a dead mouse on your gums, drinking crushed emeralds, swallowing live toads, and smearing human fat on your face. Spoiler alert, none of these work. And if they do treat you and you still die, it's your fault. Obviously, you angered God or you wouldn't have died. Or worse, you're a witch. Speaking of witches, another thing that made the Dark Ages terrible was the fact that they actually thought witches were trying to sabotage them. If someone looked a little strange, lived alone, had a cat, talked to themselves, or was simply disliked by their neighbors, they might be labeled a witch. Moles, scars, or birthmarks were also signs of being a witch. They were thought to be marks left by the devil. During times of crisis, like plagues or when crops went bad and people died of starvation, when people looked for something to blame and the so-called witches were first up. They believed witches could curse crops, cause sickness, and were even friends with the devil. Once a poor woman was accused of being a witch, they would be tortured until they confessed, even if they were innocent. The punishment for being guilty of a witch was often execution, most of the time by burning at the stake or hanging. Now that we're finally done talking about all those people dying, let's move on to your family. You probably marry young and have as many kids as your wife's body can take. Most of your kids will die before they're 10, so you have to make sure you have enough so a few survive. And your wife? Probably chosen by your family for some land. The idea of romance in the Dark Ages is basically just hoping the person you marry doesn't smell worse than goats. And for my female viewers, you had no legal rights. You weren't allowed to make your own decisions and often were treated like property. So, I guess that sucks to be you. You lived in a house made of wood and straw with dirt floors. It was cold in winter, hot in summer, and flammable year-round. Your furniture was maybe a wooden bench, a table, and straw mattresses on the floor. If you were lucky to have a bed, you definitely had to share it with bugs. You and everyone around you lived among their own waste. Diseases spread like wildfire, and rats, lice, and fleas were everywhere. On top of that, there wasn't really a justice system like a regular judge, lawyer, or police officers like we have now. They had their own way of handling things. So let's say you get accused of a crime. You stole some bread, looked at someone funny, or you owned 3 cats and someone got suspicious. Here's some of the trials you could have. 1. Trial by combat. This was literally when you fought for your innocence. It was believed that God would make whoever was actually telling the truth win. This was used when there wasn't enough evidence to determine if someone were guilty or innocent. The loser was usually considered guilty and punishments would be severe. Death, mutilation, or loss of property, so I hope you're good at fighting. 2. Trial by water, where you get thrown in a river. If you sink, you're innocent. Float, you're guilty. 3. Trial by fire, where you carry a red-hot iron and see if your hand heals, and if it does, you're fine and innocent. If you were found guilty, some of your punishments were branding, whipping, cutting off ears, and execution for funsies. No lawyers, just pain. Justice back then was basically a lottery where the prize is, you get to live another day. Now, there were millions of things that could kill you back in the Dark Ages, but some of the weirdest deaths recorded back then were when 200 people died after sharing soup cooked in a lead pot, and in 1091 when London got hit by a tornado. Nobody knew what it was, so they blamed Satan. And of course, in 1322, when a pig was put on trial for murder in France, it was hanged in public. Poor guy never saw it coming. There were also these dancing plagues where people danced uncontrollably for days and dropped dead from exhaustion. And for the icing on the cake, people believe sneezing expelled demons, so not saying bless you was suspicious. Somehow, your ancestors survived this, so you could be watching this video right now. So, yeah, I hope that makes you feel terrible.